Welcome to my channel, where I dive into the darkest horror narratives. Got a chilling story, real or imagined, that you want me to narrate? Drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales. Now, close your eyes and let the terror begin. Story 1. I know they say Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but for me it's Halloween. I deck the hall with cobwebs and fake spiders. It's just such a special time. Autumn is here, and the leaves are beginning to fall. It's a time for dressing up and suspending reality. We sit in our cozy homes with our jack-o'-lanterns and candy, scaring ourselves, and almost will ourselves to see something otherworldly. My daughter has always loved scary Halloween stories, and last year was no different. We were at the kitchen table hollowing out our pumpkins and drawing scary faces on them ready to carve. As we scooped the stringy seeds into a large bowl on the table, she asked, "Is it time yet? Time for stories?" "Okay," I smiled at her. "Where should we start? How about the monkey's paw?" No, that's an old one," she grimaced. "Tell me something new." Okay. And I glanced out of the window and saw the moon disappearing behind a cloud. "Right, I've got one for you." And as we scooped and carved, this is the story I told her. Once upon a time, long ago, there was a boy named Jacob, and he lived with his father in a house on the outskirts of a forest. One night his father roused him from a deep sleep. "My son," he whispered, "I have to go out. One of the women in the village is about to give birth, and I must be there." Jacob's father was the village doctor and much respected. But father, Jacob mumbled sleepily. What about the wolf? There had been sightings of a large wolf around the edges of the village and the forest, and the villagers were living in fear. "Don't be afraid, son," his father reassured him. "I'll lock all the doors and windows, and you'll be perfectly safe." The boy's chin trembled, but he trusted his father and agreed to try and go back to sleep. Once his father had gone out, Jacob couldn't sleep. Every noise and creak in the house seemed amplified. He took his blankets from the bed and curled up in front of the window, waiting for his father to return. He saw the full moon through his window and was comforted by the light. Smells of the night forest wafted through his window, and he dozed fitfully. Eventually, he saw the lights from his father's car coming back up to the house. He was so relieved he ran to meet him. Jacob's father saw a huge wolf bound out of the house towards his car. But before he could do anything, he heard the sound of a shotgun, and the wolf fell to the ground. From the edge of the forest, a group of villagers appeared. They had formed a posse and been out hunting the wolf. At first, they didn't understand the doctor's anguished cry. "What have you done?" he yelled, and he ran to the spot where the wolf had dropped, grabbing its body and cradling it in his arms. As it took its last breath, the villagers were horrified to see the wolf's massive furry body transform back into that of a child. "So the doctor's son was the wolf?" my daughter asked, her brown eyes wide. "That's a sad story, Mommy." "I guess it is, sweetheart. But sometimes horror is sad as well as scary. Anyway, I think these are ready to be lit." Our pumpkins were finished, and we carried them into the living room. We put them on the low table in front of the TV and lit candles in them. Tradition dictated now. It was time for spooky cartoons. She'd seen them many times before and quickly got bored. She picked up a dusty pack of tarot cards from the table. "Tell me my future, Mommy." I sighed. "I don't like to use those anymore, honey. How about I tell you another story?" "Is it about tarot cards?" she asked. "No, although the magician in it did use cards to do some of his magic tricks. This story is called Smoke and Mirrors. She curled into me on the sofa, and I began. Once upon a time, there was a man, and he made his living doing magic tricks. He did children's parties and very small venues. He wasn't very good, and most of the time, people could tell when he switched cards or pulled things from up his sleeves. Then one day he was browsing the local newspaper when he saw an advertisement. Free to good home, pair of magic cabinets. Amaze your audience. Well, he was very keen. He didn't earn much money, and that was the kind of thing he would love to use in his act, but could never afford. He quickly rang the number on the avert and arranged to go pick them up. When he saw them, they were more than he could have ever hoped. They were roughly 6 feet tall and hexagonally shaped. Each outside wall was covered in full-length mirrors. The doors on the front swung open noiselessly, and the interior was lined in plush black velvet. The magician couldn't believe his luck and asked why the man was just giving them away. The seller just replied that he had no use for them anymore. "So how do they work?" asked the magician. The seller disappeared back into his house for a moment and came back carrying a large cage with a parrot in it. "I don't know how this works," he admitted, "it just does." And he put the parrot into one of the cabinets. He walked to the second cabinet and knocked on the door 3 times. "Welcome back," he boomed in a very theatrical tone. A hissing sound came from the first cabinet, and smoke could be seen coiling from the cracks around the door. He opened the door of the second cabinet, and there was his parrot in its cage. "Oh, these are marvelous," squealed the magician excitedly. He loaded them into his dilapidated old van. "Just one word of caution," said the seller. "When I procured them, I was told under no circumstances to use a human being when doing this trick. I suggest you invest in a parrot yourself." The magician nodded his head eagerly and went on his way. After this, things quickly picked up for the magician. While the rest of his act was still mediocre at best, people were very impressed with his magic cabinet act. He would leave the cabinets where people could examine them during his performance and do his transportation trick last. For most of his act, the audience would be barely watching, poking and prodding at the cabinets and trying to work out their secret. The magician was very proud of his new act, but something was bothering him. He currently used either a rabbit or a goldfish in a bowl for his cabinet trick, and he felt there was something a little dull about that. One day, as he was reaching the finale of his show, he realized his rabbit had escaped. He tried to explain, but the audience began to jeer him. Someone from the crowd shouted out that they would quite happily get into the cabinet. In desperation, he agreed. A tall, muscular man made his way through the audience and got into the first cabinet. The magician was very nervous. He knocked on the door of the second cabinet and loudly announced, "Welcome back." Clouds of hissing smoke roiled from the first cabinet, and the door of the second cabinet swung open. The tall, muscular man stepped out. He looked a little dazed, but none the worse for his experience. The audience clapped, and that was the show over. For the next few months, the magician carried on with his show, sometimes 2 performances a day, only now he used audience members for the transportation trick. He thought it looked more impressive, and the audience loved it. One evening after a busy day, he was sitting relaxing, watching TV, when he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a story on the news about a man who had gone crazy and killed his family with a kitchen knife. The magician recognized the man instantly, the tall, muscular man who had been the first to go into his cabinet. He couldn't eat or sleep, and nagging fears ran through his mind. In the end, he determined to go visit the killer in prison. He faced the killer through a thick glass pane. He picked up the phone on the wall next to him and gestured for the prisoner to do the same. "You may not remember me," he began. "Oh, I know who you are, Magic Man," the killer interrupted. "And I'm glad you've come. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me," stammered the magician. "For what?" "Why, for welcoming me back into the world," smiled the killer. "I don't understand." "It's so much cooler here," the killer smirked. "So much cooler and so many opportunities." "I don't understand," repeated the magician. "Why did you kill your family? What happened in the box?" The killer began to laugh. It was a sound that chilled the magician to the bone. "So it was an accident?" He laughed harder. "You stupid little man. Didn't you know? Your cabinets are portals. We have been watching and waiting for so long. We can't fit into parrots or fish or rabbits, but give us a human body. A demon can fit nicely into a human body. How many people have passed through your cabinets, Magic Man?" And with that, he dropped the phone and got up and walked back into the prison. The magician sat numbly. In his estimation, it was well over 100. "Ooh!" My daughter's eyes were like saucers. "So 100 demons on the earth?" "Oh, at least," I chuckled. I'm not sure the magician's maths was very good. "Anyway, baby girl, it's getting very late now. It's time we tucked you up in bed." We headed up the stairs and got her settled. She was very sleepy now. It had been a long night. "Tell me the Halloween story, Mommy," she asked. "Now, which story would that be?" I teased. "How about the one about the hitchhiker?" She shook her head. "The Halloween story, Mommy." She giggled. Okay, I smiled. "Now you're sure you won't have bad dreams?" She shook her head more vehemently and grinned. I would never understand why my daughter loved this story so much, but I began. Once upon a time, there was a kindly queen, and she lived in a big castle in a kingdom far away from here. Her husband, the king, however, was mean and cross almost all the time, and one day he threw her down the castle stairs. The queen was badly hurt, and after that, she couldn't have any children. She had always loved children, and every Halloween, she would invite all the children from the surrounding village to the castle, which would be decorated with hundreds of carved pumpkins and thousands of candles. She'd give them the finest treats, and the children always had a wonderful time. Eventually, the king died, and the queen was left alone. Now, I know you probably think she'd be pleased that the evil king was dead, but all that happened was that she got more and more lonely. She realized what she had missed out on in her life and became sad and bitter. Her heart grew cold and black. She would look from the castle tower and see the little children playing in the courtyard, and it no longer gave her joy. Their laughter grated on her like nails on a chalkboard, and an evil plot hatched in her mind. The next Halloween, she shooed the cooks and the maids from the kitchen and prepared all the Halloween treats herself. They were the most sumptuous candies and cookies, made with only the finest ingredients. There was one ingredient she used that had no place in her recipes. She liberally mixed rat poison in with the sugar, and there was sugar in everything she made. Just like all the years before, the children came to her Halloween party, and like every other year, they stuffed themselves with all the goodies the queen had provided. As usual, they all had a wonderful time, and at the end of the night, their parents came and took them home. That was a terrible night in the village. Some of the children were terribly sick, and a lot of them even died. I heard a tiny snuffle from my daughter and looked down to see her sleeping peacefully. I kissed her forehead and made my way quietly out of her room. If she made it to the end of the story, she'd always say, "And that's why I'm not allowed to go trick-or-treating, isn't it, Mommy?" I thought back to the inspiration for my cautionary tale. That terrible Halloween night 6 years ago, when some crazy woman had poisoned the children's candy. The sound of sirens filled the night air, and there were parents panicking and crying in the street. My neighbor came rushing out of his house, holding his limp son in his arms, the jack-o'-lantern on the step tumbling down in front of him and splattering into mush on the sidewalk, while he made a noise of pain so terrible it barely sounded human. I stood on my porch and stared at it, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding in front of me. Some of the children were dead before an ambulance even arrived. The clock on the mantelpiece downstairs struck 12, pulling me back to reality, and I turned and looked back into my daughter's room. The witching hour had come and gone, and our special day was over. Her bed was empty. Story 2. One last trick or treat in the glass. It was pitch dark outside. Why wasn't the light working? The knocking stopped. A tree branch, perhaps, or something else tapping on the porch. The peephole glared at me, that little glass orb suddenly bulging with some half-promised horror. I swallowed, or I tried. My throat was dry, the warm beer on the floor suddenly inviting. "It's nothing," I said out loud, hoping that the familiar echo of my voice off the walls would ground me somehow. I walked up to the door and peered out, only seeing the orange cones cast by the halogen streetlights a distance away. Nothing. I thought to myself, feeling childishly stupid. I sucked in a deep breath, feeling my lungs strain, then let the air stream out slowly. Then another knock. I turned back around to face the door. My heart punched at the inside of my chest, its crazed dance playing counterpoint to the knocking. I wasn't surprised to see my hands shake as I reached for the doorknob. Our town was a safe one, far from the troubles of the big cities, or so we'd read in the papers. We had little more to fear in the night than seeing our trash strewn across the yard by the nimble fingers of raccoons. I threw the door open. The porch lights winked on, suddenly blinding me. I blinked away the white spots from my vision. A pair of children stood on my porch. They must have been 9 or 10. I couldn't see much more off them because they were in the classic Halloween getup. A simple sheet draped over each of them, a pair of holes cut out for them to see through. A pair of small baskets for candy broke the smooth lines of the sheets. The toes of brand new dress shoes peeked out from under the sheets. A boy and a girl, I thought. Trick or treat. Such a common refrain. I'd expected the words, but not the delivery. There were but 2 figures in front of me, yet their voices seemed to come from a great distance away. Trick or treat. The pair spoke again. I felt a little discomfited at the distortion in their voices. More than the weird volume, their voices seemed to blend into each other's, with some strange harmonics at play at the edges. It seemed almost as though there was a choir of 2, just there, speaking to me. Treat, I guess, I said. More than anything, I wanted those 2 away from my house. The whole situation felt wrong, the familiar veneer of the season concealing something deeper, something rotten, like that small panic when biting into a fruit and feeling that lack of resistance. Your teeth sinking into soft mush instead of sweet flesh. For a moment I blamed the haze of alcohol, the dregs of sleep clouding my judgment, but adrenaline had swept those far away. My fear was true. I turned to the counter where I kept my keys and grabbed for the bag of candy I had prepared for the occasion. I was half hoping that the 2 figures would be gone when I returned to the door. That they'd been a figment of my imagination, perhaps a shadow of some dream brought on by cheap horror movies and cold pizza. I had no such luck. The pair hadn't moved an inch. They each raised their baskets. There was already an assortment of candy there. They'd had a good day. A bit late for you guys to be out, isn't it? Where are your parents? The only answer I got was an impatient shaking of the baskets, the rasp of candy wrappers rustling. I held out a handful of candy, ready to drop it and call it a night. I expected to see a small pale hand clutching at the handle of the basket. Instead, I saw the anemic matte sheen of plastic. The basket was draped off the plastic hand of some kind of store mannequin. I was more than thoroughly creeped out by this effective little trick. I shrugged. Maybe the voices were recorded, a little technology to bolster an otherwise traditional costume. I felt the fear melting away as I explained it to myself in my head. Just some clever little children, probably with the help of an adult. Smart, I thought. It had certainly got me going for a while. Stay safe, I told them, dropping the last of the candy into the baskets. They didn't acknowledge me. They just stood still on the worn wooden boards of my porch. I shut the door on them. The window darkened as the light on the porch shut off. Odd. Maybe the motion detection stopped working. Some unbidden instinct that told me to stay there and wait. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch as the two walked off. Still, the light stayed dark. My relief grew as the odd strangers left my property. Still, something didn't sit right. Something wasn't right. The light was working. It turned on when it detected me. It saw me. It didn't see the kids. The sensor was working. It was state-of-the-art, passive infrared. Detected motion by detecting changes in temperature, like a human body, like mine, but not the kids. Whatever was under those pristine white sheets wasn't warm at all. The realization washed over me, like an ice cube running down my spine. My breath came in short rasps. I had to see. I had to know. I could barely bring my hand to the curtains. They were shaking so bad. When I pinched the edge of the curtain between my thumb and my finger, the curtain began to undulate wildly. I filled my lungs and peered out through the glass. They were still there, barely 20 yards away, doing nothing, just standing there, motionless, facing the street. As I watched, they both swiveled their heads, in perfect tandem, to affix 2 pairs of fathomless eye holes on the window. There was no way they could have seen me come to the window. I had to put the back of my hand in my mouth and bite down hard to keep from calling out. They knew I was there. I backed away from the window, dragging my leaden feet over the carpeted floor. I barely noticed when my heel knocked the can back. The beer leaked out onto the carpet, leaving a widening patch in front of me. I couldn't believe the raw animal fear those two had summoned up in me. Every instinct I had told me to run, get help. Anything but stay and be trapped in my own house. What could I do? Call the police and tell them that I was scared of 2 little children trick-or-treating? Call one of my friends past midnight and ask them to come over like a little boy crawling to his parents' room after a nightmare? The situation was ridiculous. My mind told me so, that there had to be a rational explanation for everything. But I could not explain away the light, fluttery feeling in my stomach. I could not rationalize the prickly lump at the back of my throat. They'd only said 3 words to me in those unearthly tones. Who knew how cold those lips were? I shut the door to the kitchen, the sound echoing through the empty house. I turned my chair to face the front door, and then I waited, white-knuckled, for the dawn to come. I must have fallen asleep sometime during that long, cold wait, not daring to move from my chair, paralyzed with fear that one of those shrouded children would appear at my window, or worse yet, behind me. But even that manic store of energy wore out as the night wound to a close. I was woken up by a polite knock on the front door. I sat bolt upright, nearly falling off my chair. I stumbled to the door, a hint of the dread from a few hours ago still lingering like a stale funk in the air. I checked the peephole again. This time, I was confronted with the well-scrubbed face of one of our town deputies. We'd been to school together. It was that kind of smallish town where you'd know almost everybody your age if they had a history there. He was an earnest man, tough but fair. "Good morning, officer." "Good morning," he replied. The sour look on his face told me that it was anything but that. His nose twitched as he took in the stale, sour smell of beer steaming off the floor in the morning sun. "Had a good night last night?" I thought back to the night before. No, I didn't. The lawman was quick to see the fleeting shadow of doubt wash across my face. He pressed home his advantage. "You care to explain why you stole the 2 mannequins from the store, dressed them up and put them on your lawn?" He shifted to the side, and past his door-filling bulk, I saw 2 familiar shapes on my lawn. My lungs wouldn't fill with air. They were still there. They'd been there the whole time. "You okay, buddy?" The big man leaned in, blocking my view, and steadied my shoulder with one of his strong hands. I brushed his hand off and lurched out into the yard, mindless of the freezing dew on my bare feet. The pair stood there, the draped sheets joined in between them. They were holding hands. The 2 of them were holding hands. I brought my palm down gingerly on the head of the one nearer to me. Hard. I felt hard plastic. I whipped the sheet off with one smooth motion. I gave a strangled cry as I stared into the empty green eyes of a child mannequin. I backed away. Too quick. I ended up on my ass on the cold grass, clawing and scrambling backwards until I bumped into the solid legs of the deputy behind me. He'd been quick to recognize my unease earlier. He was just as quick to realize genuine fear. He hoisted me back to my feet and helped me back into my house. Mind telling me what that was all about? He dumped me on the office chair in front of my computer. I tried, but I couldn't force the words out. The deputy sighed and settled onto my couch, wrinkling his nose at the empty beer cans on the side table. He leaned forward. "First call of the morning after Halloween, and I'm chasing down some bullshit break-in to a store in the middle of town. Now I've got you hung over and scared shitless from a damned pair of dolls on your front yard. What I know is someone got into a store, smashed up the glass, stole sheets and a couple of mannequins. Bloody kids again, except the glass." The lines on his brow deepened. I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down. The glass was on the outside of the shop only. Damnedest thing. You've got a camera on your yard, don't you? I nodded numbly. "What say you give me another 10 minutes of your time, tops? We go through that footage. I see who put those things on your lawn, and then I'll be out of your life, hopefully for good." I turned to face my computer and called up the stored videos on my hard drive. They were all transferred by Wi-Fi, convenient for the time that I bought the cameras. Just put on double speed backwards. We'll see who set them there soon enough. I hit the reverse play key and upped the speed. I saw the 2 of us scuttle from the house to the lawn and back again. Then, the first rays of the sun, retreating from the grass, pulling back over the pair of figures until they were back in darkness. The 2 of them stood there motionless for the longest time. When the 2 figures moved, all by themselves, in a jerky, swaying motion, back from my lawn to my front door, the cursor danced a little jig in the corner of the screen as the shakes returned, stronger than before. The sharp hiss behind me told me I wasn't alone in my discomfort. I shuddered as I watched myself on screen, so close to the two abominations, giving them a handful of candy each. I slowed the recording back to normal speed. On screen, I saw myself turn back into the house to retrieve the candy. The two figures stood there impassive. As one, they both fixed those dark eye holes on the sheets on the camera. There was something else, unmistakable. There was a slight pulse in the sheets, a small undulation. The mannequins were breathing. I've seen enough. I turned to look at the deputy, his face as white as the sheets on the shrouded figures on the screen, his hand tight around the grip of his sidearm. That, of all the things, scared me most of all. A symbol of law and order, who had seen the worst of what our little community had to offer, just as scared as I was and ready to pull a gun in my house. I clicked the window shut and got up. I wandered over to my cabinet. I pulled out a pair of tumblers and a bottle of the good stuff. The bottle gave a couple of contented glugs as I sloshed the rich golden whiskey into the glasses. I set one down in front of the other man and took a sip from my glass. A lawman could lose his job drinking on duty. The deputy didn't hesitate when he emptied half his glass. He didn't look at me when he spoke. My old Nan wasn't from around here. She was back from the old country, across the sea. She hated Halloween, said there were things out that night that weren't meant to see the light of day. One night a year, she told me, for one single night, some things were set loose. The candy and costumes were a new thing. Back in the past, on All Hallows' Eve, good folk crossed themselves and prayed and stayed in. Whatever's on that recording, it's not what our town needs, you understand. Dumb high school kids, I said, the lie taking shape and form in my mouth. Fooling around. The lie fleshed out, took on a veneer of credibility. That would be the explanation. No one had to know the dark kernel of that story. And your camera, it was having technical difficulties that night. Never was a good piece of equipment. Regretted buying it the same week. He stuck out his hand, and we shook on it. And I have kept my word too now. There isn't a good reason why I broke my promise. I'd never known true fear till that night. But I replay it in my head, over and over. The recording is long gone, of course, but every detail of that night has been branded on my mind. I remember the fear, but I cannot think of a single action the two of them had done to threaten me. Eerie, unnatural, but without a drop of malice. It'll be Halloween soon. I know where I'll be on that dark night. Some things roam the streets that shouldn't be there. The masks and costumes aren't always for the children. Sometimes they're there for the adults, for our own protection. After the deputy left, I watched the video, forwards, just once. I remember seeing the two figures on my lawn, slowly inching their hands up, locking them under the sheets, and waiting for the sun to rise. Things that shouldn't be out on this good earth. But sometimes, just sometimes, they just want the simple things. Like one last trick or treat. Story 3. It came from the haunted house. From across the street. To give you a quick introduction, my dad's name is Martin, but his friends called him Marty growing up. He moved to a small town in Mississippi when we was 8 years old. It was about a 20-minute bike ride from the Mississippi River. It wasn't an ideal place to live, but his parents could not afford much better. My dad ended up spending the remainder of his childhood stuck in this town. He plotted several attempts to run away, but he wasn't able to escape until shortly after he graduated high school. When his family first arrived at their new home, my dad immediately noticed there was something strange about the house across the street. It was 2 stories, but the top half leaned to one side, like it could collapse at any moment. The old house was an eyesore for the neighborhood. Every glass window had been shattered and boarded up. It had once been painted a light green, but most of the color had been chipped away, revealing the dark, rotting wood underneath. The front yard was nothing but dirt, with a short staircase leading to a roof-covered porch. When my dad asked his parents who lived there, they told him it was empty and that he should never, ever go near it. My dad's bedroom window faced out in the direction of the street. He had a direct view of the decrepit house, and as the days passed, he started to notice that both his fear and curiosity were intensifying. He began waking up with nightmares, terrified that something might be happening across the street. After his parents would tuck him into bed, he found himself frequently getting up at night and staring outside his window. He wanted to make sure that all appeared safe before closing his eyes. About 2 months after moving in, my dad stood in front of his window late one night. He noticed that there was something unusual about the house. It had always been an eerie pitch black, but that night there was a light on the porch, ominously flickering in the darkness. He was afraid, so as any young child would do, he went to wake his parents. His mom and dad followed him back to his bedroom, and together they peered outside his window, but the light was gone. The pitch-black darkness had returned. My dad swore and promised that he saw a light, but his parents assured him it was probably just a bad dream, kissed his forehead, and tucked him back into bed. The following morning was the first day at his new school. He would meet some of his best friends in his 3rd grade class. It was Jake, Boone, Grady, Parker, and my dad, Marty. They would call their group the High Five Troop. They were inseparable and would frequently show off their super-secret high five handshake in front of their fellow classmates. They were definitely the cool bunch on campus. The boys were immediately fascinated when they found out where my dad was living. They each had their own stories about the infamous house and shared that their parents had also warned them to never go near it. There was a lot of mystery surrounding the house, and their stories varied. But one thing they all agreed on was that it was definitely haunted. Every night, my dad would continue to check outside his window to see if the light had returned. About a week or so passed when he was awoken by a strange noise. The days had been warm, and he would leave his window cracked open at night to catch an evening breeze. He silently laid in bed, holding his breath, trying to determine what the eerie sound was and where it was coming from. He soon realized it was resonating from outside. It was a repetitive, high-pitch creaking, like a rusted door hinge opening and closing over and over again. He got up and stared out his window. The light had reappeared, once again flickering on and off. However, this time, he could see that the porch was not empty. Something was swaying in unison with the odd noise. He rubbed his eyes and slapped his cheeks, hoping that it was just his imagination or a bad dream. But he was wide awake, and the flickering light held just long enough to reveal what was making the disturbing sound. Seated in a tall, rounded chair was a woman, and with each creaking movement, she rocked slowly back and forth. My dad was frozen in fear, and remembers trying to scream for his parents, but all that exited his lungs was a heavy breath of heart-pounding emptiness. He watched as the woman slowly sat up from her rocking chair. The tall, mysterious figure began to rigidly walk down the porch stairs, across the dirt yard, and towards my dad's house. She stopped in the middle of the dimly lit street. My dad says she was standing hunched over, with long gray hair that covered her face and dangled past her waist. He could see that her hands were raised out in front of her. She was holding 2 long crochet hooks and moved her hands back and forth as she stood knitting in the middle of the road. He was able to snap out of his state of paralyzing panic as he turned and raced for the hallway. He began hysterically crying at his parents' bedside. My dad tried to explain what he saw to his worried parents, but says he was barely able to speak clearly. His parents were finally able to calm him down, and his mom spent the rest of the night in his room comforting him. At school, he shared what he had witnessed with the rest of the High Five troop. They were captivated, and his story sparked the boys' imagination with suggestions on how my dad should approach the situation. One such bright idea came from Boone, who sarcastically recommended that my dad just walk over, ring the doorbell, and introduce himself to his freaky neighbor. This got a good laugh from the group, but ultimately led to the concept for their final plan. The boys had all been told stories about the haunted house next door, but Jake, Boone, Grady, and Parker were ready to see it for themselves. So one night, they arranged to have a sleepover at my dad's house. They did not all fit in my dad's bedroom, so they set up their stuff to camp out downstairs. With the hopes of catching a glimpse of the strange woman, the boys devised a plan to take a ball of yarn from their school's art supply closet. They would sneak out before it was dark and string each end from house to the other. They believed that if they were lucky, the knitting woman would take their bait and follow the line back to my dad's house. Jake was brave enough and volunteered to run one end of the ball of yarn up to the porch, while the rest of the troop kept watch. It was a success. The plan was now in place, and all the boys had to do was wait. Absurd idea, right? My dad asked me. Maybe just a little bit it, I admitted with a playful grin. Well, we were just a bunch of third graders, but guess what? The plan worked. My dad continued to elaborate. The idea was that the boys would take turns staying awake. Whoever was on watch was equipped with a flashlight and was ready to wake up the rest of the group if anything suspicious happened. The nearby kitchen window was left open for the purpose of both running the other end of the yarn inside the house, while also to listen for the sounds of the rocking chair. My dad stayed up for the first hour, handing off the flashlight to Parker, before settling into his sleeping bag and falling asleep. He's not sure what time it was, or who was supposed to be on the lookout, but he was startled awake by a loud and familiar noise. He sat up, looking around the room. It was hard to see in the dark, and my dad started calling out for his friends, nudging them all awake. "Who has the flashlight?" My dad kept asking in a loud whisper. Boone had fallen asleep during his watch. He was alerted awake by my dad's commotion and immediately turned on the flashlight, shinning it in the direction of the creaking noise. The rest of the group was now awake, and together they gasped when the light revealed an empty wooden rocking chair, rapidly swaying back and forth in the corner of the room. "Where did that come from?" Boone asked, startled. The boys were all terrified, huddled together and unsure of what to do. Suddenly a deep and raspy shriek came from the darkness behind them. "Marty! Marty!" the voice cried. Boone turned around, shining the flashlight into the direction of the kitchen. Standing just beyond the open window was the mysterious woman. Parker was the wimp of the group and screamed, jumping into his sleeping bag to hide. The rest of the boys gripped each other tightly, interlocking arms. "Marty, what is your favorite color? Marty." "What is that thing?" Jake shouted. "How does it know your name?" My dad was just as afraid as the rest, and even more disturbed to hear the unfamiliar woman calling out his name. Boone was shaking. As you could see, he was struggling to hold the flashlight straight. The woman was slouched over with her head down. Her hands were moving quickly back and forth, as she was holding on to her crochet hooks. "What is your favorite color, Marty?" The woman shrieked again as she began to move closer, one stiff and rigid step at a time. My dad was speechless, in a state of complete terror-stricken shock. "Answer it!" Grady shouted, shoving my dad in front of him. "Marty! Tell me, Marty!" The woman had slowly walked her way from the kitchen and was now towering above the terrified kids. She slowly lifted her head, revealing a ghostly face hidden underneath her long gray hair. She stared directly into the beam of the flashlight. My dad still vividly recalls her sinister appearance. Her eyes were dark, empty holes. Her face was sickly white, with wrinkles on top of wrinkles, and the bottom half of her jaw dangled loosely like it was dislocated. "Marty! What is your favorite color? Marty!" The woman scowled one last time before my dad shouted out his response. "Blue!" As soon as my dad answered, the flashlight bulb exploded. The room was again pitch black, and all at once, in unison, the boys all let out a horrified scream. Then suddenly, the lights in the room turned on. "What in God's name is going on down here?" my dad's mom hollered. The boys were all frantically looking around the room, but there was no sign of the woman or her rocking chair. Everything was in order, like nothing had happened. The boys tried to explain what they had witnessed, but my dad's mom was clearly upset by their raucous behavior. They promised they would keep quiet for the rest of the night, but requested that all the lights be left on. This was only the first of many bizarre encounters Jake, Grady, Boone, Parker, and my dad would experience. They all came to the agreement that they had indeed seen a ghost that night. But the story doesn't end there, not for my dad. The boys never saw the spirit of the rocking chair woman ever again, but my dad is pretty certain that she came back to visit him one last time. A couple of short months later, it was Christmas. The last gift my dad opened was tucked behind the tree, in an unwrapped cardboard box. It had his name scribbled across the top in messy, cursive handwriting. He slowly broke the taped seal and peeked inside. "What is it, Martin?" his mom asked in excitement. He reached inside and pulled out a fuzzy hand-knitted sweater. His mom began to smile. "Wow, that is beautiful. Who's it from?" "It didn't say," my dad responded, as he could feel a rush of fear-induced panic beginning to course through his body. His family never determined who the holiday gift was from, but my dad says he immediately knew. The first thing he noticed when he pulled out the sweater from the box was that it had been hand-knitted in his favorite color, blue. My dad says his mom forced him to wear the sweater that year for the family Christmas pictures. Somewhere at our house, stored away in the attic, are some of my dad's old childhood photo albums. He insists that if you look through his pictures, you'll find one of him wearing the blue sweater. It is a Christmas my dad will never forget, and a haunting gift he wishes he did not receive. "So the ghost you saw, do you have any explanation for who, why, or how the heck it knew your name?" I asked him. "Well, we are talking about the supernatural, so anything beyond understanding is possible," he retorted. "But I remember that Christmas, my mom kept saying the sweater reminded her of something Nana would have knitted. Did you ask your grandma if the gift was from her?" I replied. I never had a chance to meet my grandmother. I'm not even sure what she looked like. We had no pictures of her. My dad responded in a softer tone. She had passed away shortly after I was born. "Sorry to hear that. I never knew that happened." I sympathized. "So then you're saying you think maybe the spirit you saw was..." "You choose to believe what you want," my dad interrupted. "In the town I grew up in, your truth is all you had, because nothing made any sense. My dad paused for a brief moment. To answer your question, yes. I do think I was visited by the spirit of my Nana, but what else did I have to believe? You see, without creating your own interpretations, finding a plausible explanation for the improbability of what you experienced, you would just go crazy, and some us did. My dad ended his story by saying he still has a lot of unanswered questions about what he and his friends saw that night. But there was one thing he did know for certain. He never wore that blue sweater ever again. Story 4, don't ever take your eyes off your children. This Halloween. Dad, just a few more houses. Please. Why did I say yes? I blame myself every day, but how could I not? If you saw his face, if you saw those big, beautiful brown eyes staring up at you, I don't see how you could refuse. My son, Daniel, dressed as Captain Jack Sparrow for the second year in a row, pulled and tugged at my hand until I relented. I agreed to just a few more houses, then we go home, okay? I was weak, spurned on by love. We had finished our third block of houses. His pillow sack was almost full of all sorts of candy, a fact I was reminded of every passing minute as I lugged it around on my back. He had one of those small plastic pumpkin carriers for the front doors, and then he'd run back to me and dump the contents into the pillowcase. Our system was flawless, a perfect combination of teamwork and strategy meant to produce maximum amounts of candy. Those answering the door would see an adorable Jack Sparrow with an empty bucket, and most of them would add some extra candy bars or gum packets to accommodate the poor pirate. So he didn't need more candy. He was just enjoying the night. An unseasonably warm October after so many years of miserably cold Halloween nights. I couldn't say no. Children only have so many years of trick or treating in them, and I wanted him to make the most of each one. We walked down an alleyway to the next block, the last street before the country fields took over. The first house was lit up with orange and white lights, fake spider webs draped over their hedges. He practically sprinted up to the door, not noticing the fake body sitting on the chair. At least I thought it was fake. It started to move. I tried to yell and warn Daniel, but the body on the chair already grabbed my son's arm, emitting a howling growl at the same time. Daniel, Captain Daniel, was unfazed. He even started to laugh. I was so proud of him in that moment. After thanking the woman at the door and wishing her a happy Halloween, he sprinted back to me, excitedly dumping the contents of his conquest into the bulging pillow sack. Dad, did you see me? I wasn't scared at all. Buddy, you are a champ. If that was me, a little bit of pee would have come out. Bet on it. We shared a laugh together, and he threw his arms around me. It would be the last time either of us would laugh. I looked down at his eyeliner-streaked face, his beautifully crafted hand-sewn pirate hat, courtesy of the missus, and to my everlasting shame, I said the words that haunt me every day. Okay, little captain, one more house. There were only 3 more on the street. The 2 beside the house we had just gone to were dark and had no decorations on them. Every child and parent knows this as the universal sign of, don't bother coming to my house for candy. So we skipped those 2 and ended up at the house at the end of the road. To his credit, Daniel noticed that it also didn't have any decorations, but the front porch light was on. He looked at me, silently asking for my approval. I didn't get a sense that anything was particularly wrong or off about the house, even though it didn't have any of the lights or spider webs or fake bodies the other houses had. The outside light was on, and we could both see a red and white candy-striped bucket on the front porch. There was also a note above the bucket, and I could already guess that it instructed that you take a few pieces of candy and be on your way. But I was always cautious, ever weary. I told him to stay on the sidewalk, and I walked up to the front porch. I picked up the note. It read, "If no one should answer when you ring the bell, please take a candy and I wish you well." There were no windows that I could subtly peer into, but the house on the outside was perfectly presentable. The porch was clean, the lawn crisply cut and clearly maintained. I peered inside the bucket and my eyes lit up. Even as an adult, I knew that full-size chocolate bars were rare. But there they were. Snickers, Mars, O. Henry. All of the classics in full-sized glory. I was so excited for Daniel. I turned around and went back to the sidewalk, where he was practically brimming with energy. Even after a long night like this one, he was raring to go. I put on my best pirate voice. "All right, Captain. The note says to knock on the door, and if no one answers, you can take one of the treats from the bucket. Just one, though, okay? Make it fair for the other children." "Aye, aye, me matey," he said back in his best pirate voice. We gave each other a fist pump. He walked up the pathway to the front door. I made sure to watch him the whole way. It could be another setup, some clever house owners putting together an elaborate ruse to get the children's guard down before they revealed the big scare. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. No doubt it was a text message from my wife. I watched as my son knocked on the door and patiently waited. We agreed before the night began that if nobody answered within 10 seconds, then it was time to move on. I remember every detail of those next 10 seconds. 1. I took my phone out of my pocket, still keeping an eye on Daniel. 2. I entered the code in without looking at the phone, unlocking the screen. 3. Daniel was still waiting at the door. 4. Through muscle memory, I brought up the new messages screen, still not taking my eyes off my son. 5. He began to turn around. 6. He started to head towards the bucket left on the front porch. 7. He smiled at me. 8. I glanced down at my phone. Sent. "You and the captain okay?" 9. Reply. "On our way home." 10. Daniel was gone. I didn't register it at first. I figured he was hiding behind something. "Daniel!" I called out. "Daniel!" There was no reply. I ran up to the porch, but I found nothing. No clue as to where he had gone. There was no way he could have ran around the house, not in the span of 1 to 2 seconds. No way. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one. No parents, no kids, nobody. Did someone open the door? Was he inside? I started to pound furiously on the front door, screaming my son's name. I was screaming at the top of my lungs as I tugged at the door handle, trying to get it open. I must have screamed loud enough because the woman whose house Daniel was so brave at opened her door and yelled after me. "Is everything all right?" "No. Have you seen my son? The little boy dressed as a captain?" "Oh my goodness, no, I haven't. Should I call someone?" Call someone. His cell phone. I smacked myself in the forehead. I forgot he had one on him. I grabbed the phone out of my pocket and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I almost threw the phone away right then and there, but I tried to calm myself down. Tried to think back. But all I could picture was someone, some thing, opening the door, grabbing my son, and covering his mouth before he could scream for me. I dialed 911. I didn't care if we found him later, if he was playing some trick on me. I just wanted him back. I told the neighbor to grab a flashlight and help me look for him. When the cops arrived, the neighbor and I had been looking all around the house, trying to find a way in. I was about to break a window when I heard the sirens. those wailing screams echoing in the distance. I took such comfort in those sirens. I just knew in my heart that as soon as they got here, my son would pop out of somewhere, tell me it was all a big joke. I wouldn't scold him. I wouldn't yell at him. I would just hug and squeeze and hold on to him until he left for college. I told the cops everything, down to the exact detail as I remembered it. They also pounded on the door, but when they saw my frantic behavior, the impatience riddling my body, they went ahead and broke the door in. They told me to stay behind, let them clear the house. I wanted to protest, to scream at them, to tell them nothing could keep me away. But when they drew their guns and yelled into the house, I knew they were taking this seriously. 5 of the longest minutes of my life passed by. I don't know when she did it, but at one point I looked down, and the neighbor was holding my hand. She had children of her own. She knew what was happening, what could be happening. When the 2 cops came out of the house, the look on their faces said it all. I almost broke down there on the street, but I had to hold on a little longer. I tore into the house, past the outstretched arms of the officers, and started yelling for my son, bursting in and out of each room with ferocious intent. It wasn't until I went up the stairs into what was once a bedroom that I realized no one was living in this house. No one had been living in this house for years. I ran down the stairs, almost knocking the officers down as I ran up to the woman, the helpful neighbor. I grabbed her and started yelling, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me no one was living here?" She started to stammer, taken aback by my sudden turn, my aggression towards her. I didn't know. I've only lived on this street for a few months. I never saw anyone come in or out, but that could be for 100 different reasons. I'm sorry. I didn't know." I stood there, on the street, breathing heavily, holding onto the shoulders of a woman I only met a few minutes before. The officers placed their hands on my arms, and I released her. I looked back at the house, that 2-story monstrosity bathed in darkness, and I knew. However impossible it was, I knew right there and then. Daniel wasn't coming back. Things for me were dark, really dark, for many months afterwards. I don't really remember all of the police searches, the news bulletins, the press conferences. I ignored the pitied looks of my friends, the suspicious glares of my neighbors. My wife and I, despite everything, remained strong together. Every night we told each other, no body, no death. In our hearts, Daniel was alive. The initial investigation of the house amounted to almost nothing. The previous owner had declared bankruptcy and abandoned the house. The bank hadn't been able to sell it to anyone, so it sat there collecting dust. No one could account for the maintained lawn out front, and the police never found any bucket full of chocolate bars or any note. I don't care what they say. I know what I saw. I know there were some on the police force that suspected me. I went through rigorous interrogations, but they came up with nothing, as I knew they would. I didn't blame them. If I had been in their position, I would have suspected me as well. After 3 months, all things concerning Daniel dissipated, except for in our household. We still put out flyers all over the surrounding neighborhoods every week. We still kept up to date with social media, pleading anybody and everybody to keep an eye out for our boy. I drained my accounts, hiring private detectives to look into the house, the neighborhood, anything that I thought could help. They all came up with nothing, no clues, no traces. Daniel had simply vanished. Every night I had the same nightmare. Someone knocks on the door to our house, and I race down, hoping against all hope that it's Daniel. And every time I open the door, it is Daniel, and he's standing there in his Captain Jack uniform and his pumpkin candy carrier. I scream out in joy and grab a hold of him, except his flesh starts to melt and sift through my fingers. His body turns into sand, and suddenly my son is a pile of dust and dirt on the carpet. Then I wake up. 2 weeks ago, I was on the couch in the afternoon, staring at the ceiling when I heard a knock on the door. I got up slowly, thinking it was a reporter coming to do a follow-up, or some punk kid claiming to have seen my son, something that happened all too often. I opened the door and nearly screamed, not in joy, but in sheer terror. My son was standing there, Daniel. My wife came barreling down the stairs, and she screamed as well, but hers was all happiness. She pushed me out of the way and took Daniel up in her arms. I couldn't move. I kept waiting for his body to turn into mush, his ashes spilling through my wife's fingers. I kept waiting to wake up in my bed, sweating and crying. But that didn't happen. Against every single odd in the book, Daniel had been returned. Through all the crying and hugging and kissing, Daniel didn't say a word. He was just there. No expression on his face, nothing registering in his eyes. We put it down to shock. Clearly something had happened to him. As each day passed, not a single doctor or therapist or police officer could find anything physically wrong with him. Everything should be in working order, said one particularly pompous doctor after examining Daniel. I can't tell you where your son was or what happened to him, but whatever happened, nothing is wrong with him on the outside. Nothing was wrong with him on the outside. I nearly knocked out that smiling white coat right there and then, but I was so elated to have Daniel back that I shrugged it off, ignored it. Nothing mattered anymore. Daniel was home. Later that night, I was sitting at the dinner table after having tucked Daniel in when I came to the sudden realization that I wasn't exactly happy. I should have been. I should have been screaming over the rooftops with complete joy in my heart. But something was wrong. Daniel wasn't Daniel anymore. That happy, brave boy had come back. Different. I tried to think about why. Obviously it had something to do with where he had been, what had happened to him. But there was something else, something nagging at the back of my neck. Then with a cold, sinking feeling, I remembered. Daniel had said something when I tucked him in. He had whispered, "I like it here." I didn't register it at the time, but sitting at the table, I didn't like it. What did that mean? I ran up the stairs and opened his door. He was sleeping just as he should have been. I almost laughed out loud. What was wrong with me? My son was home. That's all that mattered. A few nights ago, I woke up in the middle of the night to see Daniel standing in the doorway. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. I looked over to my wife, but she was sleeping. I turned back to Daniel. "Hey there, Captain. Are you okay?" He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me and smiled, and for a second, my blood turned cold. My flesh raised. That smile wasn't my son. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear it. "What was that?" I asked him. Then he sprinted towards me, so fast, so quick. And he yelled, "I like it here!" Then he ran back out of our room and into his, slamming his door. My wife slept through the whole thing. Last night was the turning point. I was just about to lock the front door for the evening when my wife started screaming. And I mean screaming. I was convinced in the few seconds it took me to bound up the stairs that someone was killing her. In a way, I was right. I burst through the bedroom door to find Daniel standing over my wife with an axe. He had that dead smile on his face again. The axe was raised above his head when I tackled him. He started to scream, and I started to cry. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. "You'll like it there. You'll like it there. You'll like it there." Now I'm lost. I don't know what to do, who to turn to. And as Halloween approaches, I think I have to go back to the house where it all began. I'm going to take Daniel. Maybe he can show me where he wants us to go. Story 5, Be Home by Midnight on Halloween night. Growing up, my dad would tell me scary stories, ones he claimed he experienced during his childhood. His stories would both fascinate and terrify me. As I grew older, the stories he would share became less frequent until they eventually came to an end. Maybe because I stopped believing. I'd come to the conclusion that in a fun, twisted way, he was just finding enjoyment by filling my young imagination with haunted visions. However, after a recent trip home, my mind has been changed. I believe him and think his childhood stories are more rooted in reality than I would like to admit. Earlier this month, I returned home from college for a quick weekend visit with the family. I was sitting on the living room couch and my dad in his cozy recliner. We were flipping channels when we stopped on one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. That's when I asked him if he remembered the scary stories he would tell me as a kid. I was expecting a smiled response, but to my surprise, he seemed oddly serious. I chuckled out loud at his reaction, but with a straight face, my dad looked directly at me and said everything he once told me was the truth. We continued to talk, and he reminded me that his family had moved to a small town in Mississippi when he was about 8 years old. The house across the street was vacant, boarded up, and he would quickly come to discover it was haunted. It was 2 stories and sat tilted, like it could collapse at any moment. His parents would warn him to stay away, but that did not stop his curiosity. It was not until several years later that the house was demolished, mysteriously leaving behind only the front wooden staircase and a stone-covered well on the now eerie open field property. He thought that once the house was gone, things might be normal. He had experienced enough strange encounters firsthand, and also through stories his group of young friends would share amongst each other. But he said it wasn't just the house, nor the oddities that took place in his neighborhood, but the entire town he grew up in was far from ordinary. The more I listened to him talk, the more I started to believe again. I asked him to tell me one of his many Halloween stories. He obliged, asking if I remembered the one about the disappearance of his best friend, Jake, an event that still haunts him to this day. My parents would never let me go out trick-or-treating alone, even in high school, and I remember this caused me quite some embarrassment with my friends. I joked with him, saying all he did was shelter me from having adolescent Halloween fun. "You can blame my apocolocyosis," he responded. I had never heard that word before, so I asked him what it meant. Sounded like something he made up. "Google it," he said. "Believe it or not, there's a phobia for everything, even for your most obscure fears." My dad continued, saying he just wanted to be a good parent. He was only trying to protect me, to ensure I returned home safe and was in bed by night's end. He has never forgotten about his friend Jake and the Halloween they spent out in the park, waiting for the O-Lantern Man. Jake was my dad's first friend when he moved to the small river town. They met at school and would spend most of their free time hanging out around the neighborhood. Jake conveniently lived just a couple of streets away. As they grew older, Jake quickly garnered the reputation of being the bad boy. He was always up to trouble and began spending more time in detention than in class. There are some stories my dad would rather not share with me, mostly because he was a bit ashamed of his behavior. But Jake's antics would occasionally influence his decisions for the worse. One day, Jake vanished. He stopped showing up for class freshman year of high school, and the rumors circulating around town were that he was sent to boarding school. His house was deserted and soon had a for sale sign out in the front yard. Roughly a year or so passed, and a lot of my dad's questions about what had happened to Jake went unanswered. That is until Halloween night, when Jake made a sudden reappearance. My dad had been left home alone as his parents attended an adults-only Halloween party. He promised them he would stay inside the house and hand out candy to the trick-or-treaters. Only moments after his parents departed, there was a knock at the door. Expecting a group of kids in costumes, my dad was in shock and disbelief to see Jake standing on the porch. He was chomping down on a piece of candy, dressed in dark clothing with ripped jeans, and sported a backwards hat. It had been about a year, but my dad said Jake looked exactly the same. Jake wanted nothing to do with answering questions about his whereabouts. Instead, he pushed, teased, and under relentless peer pressure convinced my dad to accept a dare to play a Halloween variation of the game Chicken. The rules were simple. See who could stay out the latest on Halloween night without running home scared. Jake was acting very strange that night. The two weren't speaking much, so to kill some time, they ended up strolling around the neighborhood, searching for houses with candy bowls left outside. Their final stop that Halloween was at the local park a few blocks down. It was located on the darkened outskirts of the neighborhood, tucked away from the houses. My dad and Jake would frequent this spot growing up. It had a little league baseball field, and during the summers the two would spend hours playing home run derby and hanging out in the dugout. My dad remembers it being a brisk October night. As they walked through the park, all he could hear was silence and the sounds of chirping crickets that echoed in the surrounding fields. There were no lights, and other than the glow of the nearly full moon above, the park was an eerie pitch black. My dad kept wondering how the night would end. He tried thinking up several ways to scare Jake, determined to bring an end to the stupid game of Halloween Chicken, but nothing clever came to mind. It was going to take more than jumping out from behind a corner to send Jake running in fear. The two arrived at the baseball field, only spending a few minutes sitting on the steel dugout bench before Jake stood up and began pacing back and forth. Something visibly had him on edge. My dad continued to press Jake for an explanation, to answer why they were sitting out in the cold, why Jake had come back so suddenly on Halloween of all nights. When Jake noticed my dad was wearing a wristwatch, he became obsessed with asking for updates regarding the time. He first asked around 11 p.m., followed by the same question almost every 5 minutes thereafter. Finally, my dad said enough was enough. Jake was driving him insane. He grabbed Jake by the shirt collar and pressed him up against the dugout fence. One last time, my dad demanded answers, but Jake remained silent. That's when my dad finally gave up and decided it was time to go home. To this day, he is still haunted by some of Jake's final words. As he took his first step outside the dugout, he heard Jake begin to softly speak. "Be home by midnight on Halloween night, or the O-Lantern Man will sense your fright. For all bad souls who are not in bed, O-Lantern Man will snatch your head. And with your head, he will cast a spell. A pumpkin you shall be, from now until next Hallows Eve." "He's real," Jake shouted. "He's not some stupid folklore Halloween tale to scare us. The warnings are true. I have seen him with my own 2 eyes. I swear to God, O-Lantern Man is real." My dad admits his emotions caught up to him. He was freaked out by Jake's odd behavior and his urban legend warning. He did not know what to believe, and it was late. He knew he should be home, not out alone in the park. Rather than encourage Jake's bizarre behavior, my dad decided to say goodnight and continued on his way. Jake yelled out, requesting one final update for the time. My dad glanced at his watch. It was midnight, but this time he decided not to answer. He was only a short way up the gravel path when Jake let out a horrified gasp. My dad turned around and could see Jake pointing out in the direction of the outfield grass. "Do you see it?" Jake whispered out loud. My dad peered out into the surrounding darkness and in the distance could see a faint, flickering light. He stood still, watching as the mysterious glow moved closer. Attempting to get Jake's attention, my dad shouted out several times that it was time to leave. But Jake was stuck in a trance, continuing to mumble the warning out loud. "Be home by midnight on Halloween night, or the O-Lantern Man will sense your fright. For all bad souls who are not in bed, O-Lantern Man will snatch your head." The light shined brighter, moving closer with each passing second. My dad was frozen in fear, blinded by the orange blaze. It was now just outside the dugout, directly in front of Jake. A loud and high-pitched, crackling laugh echoed through the park. In a sudden moment of awareness, Jake began to run for his life. My dad says it was hard to see who or what was hiding behind the light, but he caught a glimpse of what looked like a fire-lit jack-o'-lantern, carved out with an evil, sinister face. The two friends ran together side by side, as fast as they could, away from the park and back into the neighborhood. My dad, who was quicker than Jake, continued speeding ahead. As my dad approached the porch of his house, he could hear Jake screaming in the distance. But at the moment, he could only think for his own safety and barreled his way into the house, locking the door behind him. He called out for his parents, but they were still gone. He was alone. He debated calling the police, but before he could make any rational decisions, there was a loud thud at the door. He could hear Jake screaming for help. My dad raced down the stairs towards the front door, but the loud cries quickly became a disturbing silence. Nervous to unlock the door, he shouted out several times for Jake to respond, but there was no answer. Mustering up the courage to slowly crack the door open, my dad peeked outside. He glanced around and was suddenly shaken by yet another mysterious discovery. On the porch, piled on top, the welcome mat was a dark shirt, ripped blue jeans, a pair of empty shoes, and a baseball hat. He recognized them as Jake's belongings, the same exact items he was wearing that Halloween night, and hidden underneath the clothes was a giant orange pumpkin. To this day, my dad is still unsure if it was a well-thought-out prank, or if he and Jake had indeed encountered some kind of evil entity that Halloween. But one thing my dad does know for certain: he never saw Jake again. I jokingly teased my dad about the O-Lantern Man's story, and I tried to get him to admit the absurdity of the urban legend, but he held on to his truth. He insisted that the more he thought about it, the more he believed Jake was genuinely scared that night, that something terrible had happened to him, something unexplainable. I asked him about the pumpkin, the one he found on his porch hidden beneath Jake's stuff. What happened to it? If he believed the urban legend to be true, did he save the pumpkin thinking it could be Jake? My dad said he left everything outside that night. He was so scared, he locked the door and ran straight to his room to hide in his bed. In the morning, his parents asked him what happened to the front porch. They seemed upset, and my dad played dumb, hoping that maybe it was all just a nightmare. His parents told him to go take a look, and he remembers nervously trembling as he approached the door. When he stepped outside, he saw that Jake's belongings were still there, but scattered across the entryway, and the pumpkin. It had been completely smashed. Teenage Halloween vandals. Possibly, he thinks. Or if you choose to believe the urban legend, maybe the O-Lantern Man returned to ensure that a bad soul like Jake would never be coming back to celebrate Halloween ever again. Because for Jake, Halloween was never about trick-or-treating, carving pumpkins, dressing up in costumes, or watching scary movies. His idea of Halloween fun was giving in to the impulses of mischief, causing trouble, disobeying his parents, and staying out past midnight. For those who choose to celebrate the Halloween spirit for the wrong and evil reasons, let it be known that there are consequences. The O-Lantern Man will get you. Apokalokin posis, my dad says again. Only this time, he tells me what it means. It's the fear of turning into a pumpkin. It's a real phobia, and because it exists, that means I'm not the only one who has it. I must admit, after hearing my dad recount his Halloween tale, and telling it to me today, with the same truthful seriousness, I can feel my childhood excitement for horror returning. Once my dad was done, I only had one last question for him. Can you tell me another scary story?